In the summer of 1983, the Morrison family packed their van for what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip to the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains. David Morrison, 42, a quiet accountant from Seattle, his wife Sarah, 39, an elementary school teacher, and their two children, Emma, 16, and Michael, 12, were looking forward to 3 days of hiking, fishing, and escaping the city heat. They had camped in these mountains before, always sticking to the well-marked trails near Crystal Lake. But this time, something went wrong. By Monday morning, when the family failed to return home, their neighbors grew concerned. By Tuesday, when David missed work without calling in, panic set in. The initial search began immediately. Park rangers combed every trail within a 20-mile radius of their last known location. Helicopters swept the dense forest canopy. Search dogs followed scent trails that seemed to vanish into thin air. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the effort, creating human chains across meadows and ravines. For 2 weeks, hundreds of people searched day and night. They found the family's campsite, tent still standing, food untouched, sleeping bags neatly arranged. But of the Morrisons themselves, there was no trace, no footprints leading away from the camp, no signs of struggle, no clothing caught on branches, nothing. The case baffled investigators. How does an entire family simply disappear from a secured campsite in broad daylight? The theories ranged from animal attacks to foul play to voluntary disappearance. Some whispered about David's gambling debts, others pointed to Sarah's recent inheritance. A few suggested the family had staged their own vanishing to start fresh somewhere else. But none of the theories explained the complete absence of evidence. It was as if the Morrison family had been erased from existence. Years passed. The search was officially called off. The case went cold. David's brother took over the family business. Sarah's sister adopted their elderly parents. The house in Seattle was sold. Memorial services were held. Life moved on. But the questions never stopped haunting those who knew the family. What happened to the Morrisons? Where did they go? Were they taken against their will, or did they choose to disappear? The answers seemed lost forever in the wilderness that had swallowed them whole. Then, in 2007, everything changed. A group of experienced hikers, exploring an unmarked trail, discovered something that would reopen the case and send shockwaves through the community that had never forgotten the Morrison family. What they found hidden deep in the woods would finally begin to unravel the mystery, but the truth was far stranger and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The discovery happened purely by accident. Jake Rodriguez, a veteran hiker who'd been exploring the Cascades for over 30 years, was leading a small group through what locals called the Devil's Backbone, a treacherous ridge that most tourists avoided. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and notorious for sudden weather changes that could trap hikers for days. Jake's group consisted of his daughter Maria, her boyfriend Tom, and 2 experienced climbers from Portland who were documenting remote wilderness areas for a conservation project. They were 3 hours into their hike when Maria noticed something unusual. Tucked behind a massive fallen cedar, partially hidden by decades of moss and undergrowth, was what appeared to be a structure. At first glance, it looked like a natural formation, rocks and fallen timber arranged by chance. But as they cleared away the vegetation, they realized someone had built this shelter deliberately. The construction was sophisticated, using interlocking logs and carefully placed stones to create a weatherproof hideaway that was nearly invisible from the trail. Tom, who worked in construction, immediately recognized the craftsmanship. This wasn't some hastily built survival shelter. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this hidden refuge. The entrance was concealed behind a curtain of hanging moss. Inside, the space was larger than expected, roughly 12 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling high enough for an adult to stand upright. But what they found inside the shelter would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The interior was like stepping into a time capsule from 1983. Camping gear sat exactly where it had been placed nearly a quarter century earlier. 4 sleeping bags were arranged in a neat row. A camp stove sat ready for use. Clothes were folded and stacked with military precision. Food containers, though empty, were organized on makeshift shelves carved into the rock walls. A Coleman lantern hung from a hook driven into the ceiling. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but remarkably well preserved in the dry mountain air. Jake's hands trembled as he picked up a backpack sitting near the entrance. The name tag read, Emma Morrison. His daughter gasped when she saw a smaller pack labeled Michael Morrison. Tom found a wallet containing David Morrison's driver's license, expired in 1984. Maria discovered Sarah's purse, still containing family photos, credit cards, and a grocery list written in faded blue ink. The evidence was overwhelming. This was where the Morrison family had been living after they vanished from their campsite. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In the far corner of the shelter, partially hidden beneath a tarp, they found a collection of notebooks. The pages were filled with handwriting in different styles: David's neat printing, Sarah's flowing cursive, Emma's teenage scrawl, and Michael's childish letters. The entries were dated, starting just days after the family's disappearance and continuing for months. As Jake read the first few pages, his blood ran cold. The notebooks revealed a story of terror, confusion, and desperate survival. The family hadn't vanished voluntarily. They hadn't been killed by wild animals. They had been taken, forced to abandon their campsite by someone who had been watching them, someone who knew the mountains better than any search team. The early entries described their captor as a man who claimed to be protecting them from some unnamed danger. He had convinced them to leave their campsite quietly, promising to lead them to safety. Instead, he had brought them to this hidden shelter and kept them prisoner. David's entries were clinical, documenting their daily routine with the precision of someone trying to maintain sanity through order. Sarah wrote about her fears for the children, her desperate attempts to keep Emma and Michael calm and hopeful. Emma's teenage anger came through in every line, furious at their captor, frustrated by their helplessness, determined to find a way to escape. Michael's entries were the hardest to read, a 12-year-old boy trying to understand why this was happening to his family, clinging to the belief that someone would come to rescue them. The man who held them was described as middle-aged, bearded, with an intimate knowledge of the wilderness that suggested he had lived in these mountains for years. He brought them food and supplies regularly, but always at irregular intervals, keeping them dependent and disoriented. He told them stories about other families who had disappeared in these mountains, claiming he was saving them from the same fate. The Morrisons never learned his real name. He insisted they call him Guardian. As the weeks turned to months, the the tone of the entries changed. David became increasingly depressed, documenting failed escape attempts and growing despair. Sarah's handwriting grew shaky as she struggled with the psychological pressure of captivity. Emma's anger transformed into cunning as she began planning more sophisticated escape strategies. Michael's entries became shorter, more fragmented, as the trauma took its toll on a child's mind. The final entries were the most chilling. In October 1983, 3 months after their disappearance, the family made one last desperate attempt to escape. Emma had discovered a weakness in Guardian's routine, a window of time when he was away gathering supplies. The plan was simple. They would leave the shelter together, follow the ridge down to the main trail, and signal for help. David's final entry was optimistic, almost cheerful. He wrote about seeing Emma's strength, Sarah's resilience, Michael's courage. He believed they would make it home. That was the last entry. The notebooks ended abruptly, leaving Jake and his team staring at pages that offered no conclusion to the Morrison family's story. What had happened during that final escape attempt? Had they made it to freedom only to perish in the wilderness? Had Guardian caught them and moved them to another location? Or had something else entirely happened that October night in 1983? The shelter held one more secret, one that would prove even more disturbing than the notebooks. Hidden beneath the floor, wrapped in plastic, and buried in a shallow depression, they found a collection of photographs. The images showed the Morrison family during their captivity, forced smiles at gunpoint, hollow eyes staring at the camera, the gradual deterioration of their physical and mental state documented in painful detail. But the most shocking discovery was among the final photographs, images of other families, other prisoners, other victims who had clearly been held in this same shelter over the years. The Morrison family hadn't been Guardian's only victims. This hidden shelter had been used as a prison for decades, housing family after family of unwilling captives. The photographs showed men, women, and children of various ages, all with the same haunted expression, all clearly being held against their will. Some of the images dated back to the 1970s, others appeared to be from the 1990s. The scope of Guardian's crimes was far beyond anything the investigators had imagined. Jake immediately contacted the authorities, and within hours, the remote shelter was crawling with FBI agents, state police, and forensic specialists. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. Cold case files were reopened. Missing person reports were cross-referenced. Families who had given up hope decades earlier suddenly found themselves thrust back into the spotlight as investigators tried to piece together the full extent of Guardian's crimes. The Morrison family's story had finally begun to emerge from the shadows, but their fate remained a mystery. The notebooks ended with their planned escape. The photographs showed their deteriorating condition. But what had actually happened to David, Sarah, Emma, and Michael Morrison? Were they alive somewhere, still hiding in the wilderness? Had they perished during their escape attempt? Or had something even more sinister occurred in those dark October days of 1983? The answers lay deeper in the mountains, hidden in places where few people dared to venture. And as investigators prepared to expand their search, they realized they weren't just looking for the Morrison family anymore. They were hunting for a predator who had been using the wilderness as his personal hunting ground for decades, a man who had perfected the art of making entire families disappear without a trace. The discovery of the hidden shelter was just the beginning. The real investigation was about to begin. The investigation that followed Jake Rodriguez's discovery became the largest coordinated search effort in Pacific Northwest history. FBI behavioral analysts were flown in from Quantico. Search teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar began systematically combing every square mile of the Devil's Backbone Ridge. Cadaver dogs worked in rotating shifts, their handlers following scent trails that seemed to lead deeper into the most inaccessible parts of the wilderness. Agent Rebecca Chen, a specialist in abduction cases, took point on the Morrison investigation. She had seen the photographs, read the notebook entries, studied the meticulous organization of the hidden shelter. What disturbed her most wasn't the evidence of captivity, it was the evidence of planning. Guardian hadn't been an opportunistic predator who stumbled across vulnerable families. He had been hunting them systematically, studying their patterns, choosing his victims with the precision of someone who had been perfecting his methods for decades. The forensic analysis of the shelter revealed disturbing details. Hair samples found embedded in the wooden walls belonged to at least 12 different individuals. DNA evidence suggested the presence of multiple families over a span of nearly 20 years. Carbon dating of organic materials placed the shelter's construction sometime in the early 1970s, meaning Guardian had been operating in these mountains far longer than anyone had suspected. Most chilling of all, the shelter showed signs of recent use. Someone had been there within the past few months. Chen coordinated with missing persons databases across 7 states, cross-referencing disappearances that matched Guardian's apparent methodology. The pattern that emerged was horrifying in its consistency. Every 2 to 3 years, a family would vanish during a camping trip in remote wilderness areas, always families with children, always in locations far from main trails, always with no trace left behind except abandoned campsites that suggested sudden, unexpected departure. The Hendricks family from Oregon, gone in 1979, the Kowalski family from Idaho, missing since 1985, the Reeves family from Montana, disappeared in 1991, the Patterson family from Washington vanished in 1994. The list grew longer with each database search, each cross-reference revealing another set of victims who had simply walked into the wilderness and never walked back out. Local law enforcement agencies began sharing information about unsolved cases they had attributed to animal attacks, getting lost, or voluntary disappearance. A pattern emerged of witnesses reporting strange behavior in the days before families went missing. Campers mentioned seeing a bearded man watching them from tree lines. Rangers recalled reports of someone following hikers on remote trails. Store clerks remembered a customer who seemed unusually interested in which families were planning extended wilderness trips. Guardian wasn't just taking families randomly. He was stalking them, studying them, learning their routines before making his move. The level of organization suggested someone with extensive wilderness experience, possibly military or survival training, someone who could move through dense forest without leaving tracks, who could construct sophisticated shelters using only hand tools, who could survive indefinitely in conditions that would kill most people within days. The search teams expanded their efforts, focusing on areas where Guardian might have built additional shelters or camps. Using satellite imagery and topographical analysis, they identified locations with similar characteristics to the Morrison shelter: hidden valleys, natural windbreaks, proximity to water sources, but far enough from established trails to avoid accidental discovery. Each potential site required days of dangerous hiking through terrain that challenged even experienced mountaineers. 3 weeks into the expanded search, a team led by Agent Chen made a discovery that changed everything. Following a barely visible game trail deep into a canyon that didn't appear on any official maps, they found evidence of a much larger operation. Carved into the canyon wall was a series of caves, connected by narrow passages and hidden from aerial view by overhanging rock formations. This wasn't just a shelter, it was an underground complex that could house dozens of people. The caves showed signs of long-term habitation, multiple sleeping areas, storage rooms carved into solid rock, even a rudimentary workshop where tools had been manufactured and repaired. But most significantly, they found evidence that this complex was still being used. Fresh food supplies, recently used bedding, and a calendar marked with dates from the current year. Guardian was still out there, still active, and this was his base of operations. Chen's team moved carefully through the cave system, documenting everything they found. In what appeared to be Guardian's personal quarters, they discovered journals that made the Morrison family notebooks look like casual diary entries. These were detailed operational records spanning decades, lists of potential targets, surveillance notes, maps marking escape routes, and contingency plans. Almost, Guardian had been treating his criminal enterprise like a military operation, complete with intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The journals revealed Guardian's twisted ideology. He believed he was saving families from the corruption of modern society, protecting children from the dangers of urban life by bringing them to the purity of the wilderness. His entries described himself as a shepherd, gathering lost sheep and guiding them to safety. The psychological profile that emerged was of someone who had convinced himself that kidnapping and imprisonment were acts of mercy, that his victims should be grateful for their salvation. More disturbing were the detailed records Guardian kept of each family's captivity, medical notes tracking the health of his prisoners, behavioral observations documenting their psychological deterioration, educational plans for the children, whom he apparently intended to raise as his own. The scope of his delusion was breathtaking. He had created an entire mythology around his crimes, casting himself as the hero of a story where kidnapping was rescue and imprisonment was protection. The cave complex also contained Guardian's trophy collection, personal items from every family he had taken, carefully preserved and cataloged like museum artifacts. Wedding rings, children's toys, family photographs, driver's licenses, each tagged with dates and locations. The collection confirmed the scope of his crimes while providing investigators with evidence to identify victims whose disappearances had never been connected to Guardian's activities. Among the trophies, Agent Chen found items that made her blood run cold. Recent additions to the collection suggested Guardian had taken victims within the past year. A child's backpack with a name tag reading Ashley Chin, no relation to the agent, but the coincidence sent chills down her spine. A man's watch engraved with a wedding date from just 18 months earlier. A woman's cell phone, its battery long dead, but its case still bearing recent scratches and wear marks. The investigation took on new urgency. Guardian wasn't just a historical threat, he was actively hunting new victims. The cave complex showed signs of recent expansion, suggesting he was preparing to increase his operations. Fresh excavation in one section revealed the beginnings of additional holding cells, as if Guardian was planning to house multiple families simultaneously. As forensic teams processed the evidence, Chen coordinated with park services across the region to issue emergency alerts. Camping permits were temporarily suspended in high-risk areas. Ranger patrols were increased. Warning signs were posted at trailheads, advising hikers to travel in large groups and report any suspicious activity immediately, but Guardian had vanished as completely as his victims. The cave complex was abandoned, cleared out with the same methodical precision that characterized all his operations. He had somehow detected the investigation and disappeared into the wilderness he knew better than anyone. Tracking dogs lost his scent at a stream that connected to dozens of possible escape routes. Helicopter searches revealed no movement in the vast expanse of forest and mountain terrain. The manhunt expanded to include federal marshals, state police, and volunteer search organizations. Guardian's photograph, constructed from witness descriptions and aged using computer modeling, was distributed to every law enforcement agency west of the Mississippi. His methods were analyzed and shared with park rangers across North America. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile that was distributed to mental health professionals who might encounter someone matching Guardian's psychological markers. Yet for all the resources devoted to finding him, Guardian remained a ghost. He had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility, learning to move through wilderness areas without leaving traces that even expert trackers could follow. The mountains that had hidden his crimes now hid his escape, offering countless hiding places where a man with his skills could remain undetected indefinitely. The Morrison family's fate remained unknown, but their story had exposed a predator who had operated in plain sight for decades. The hidden shelter where Jake Rodriguez had found their belongings was just one small piece of a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and countless victims. The investigation had answered some questions about what happened to the Morrison family, but raised far more disturbing questions about how many other families had suffered the same fate. As winter approached and search efforts were forced to scale back due to dangerous weather conditions, Agent Chen knew that Guardian was still out there somewhere, still planning, still hunting, still convinced that his twisted mission justified the suffering he inflicted on innocent families. The Morrison case had been solved in part, but the monster who destroyed them remained free to strike again. The search would continue when spring returned to the mountains. Until then, Guardian had the winter to plan his next move, to identify his next victims, to prepare for another family's weekend camping trip that would end not in cherished memories, but in unimaginable horror. The wilderness that had hidden his crimes for so long would protect him through the long winter months, giving him time to ensure that the Morrison family's story would not be the last chapter in his decades-long reign of terror. The winter of 2007 brought an eerie silence to the Cascade Mountains, but beneath the snow-covered peaks, the investigation into Guardian's crimes continued behind closed doors. Agent Chen established a task force headquarters in Seattle, coordinating with agencies across the country as reports of similar disappearances flooded in from every state with significant wilderness areas. The Morrison case had opened a floodgate of connections that investigators had missed for decades. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a forensic psychologist specializing in long-term captivity cases, joined the task force to analyze Guardian's journals and behavioral patterns. What she discovered painted a picture of a predator who had evolved his methods over time, becoming increasingly sophisticated with each victim. The early entries from the 1970s showed crude planning and reactive decision-making. By the 1990s, Guardian was operating with the precision of a seasoned intelligence operative. The psychological profile that emerged was deeply disturbing. Guardian exhibited traits of both a messiah complex and antisocial personality disorder, combined with survival skills that suggested military or specialized training. Dr. Hawkins noted that his journals showed no remorse for his actions, but rather a growing sense of righteousness and purpose. He genuinely believed he was saving families from the corrupting influence of modern society. More chilling was Guardian's apparent ability to psychologically manipulate his victims. The Morrison family's notebooks revealed how he had gradually broken down their resistance, using a combination of isolation, dependency, and false hope to maintain control. He would disappear for days, leaving families to wonder if he was ever coming back, then return with supplies and reassurances that their ordeal would soon end. This cycle of abandonment and rescue created a traumatic bond that made escape psychologically as well as physically difficult. The forensic analysis of the cave complex revealed technological sophistication that shouldn't have been possible for someone living off the grid. Hidden solar panels powered a communication system that allowed Guardian to monitor Park Service radio frequencies. A workshop area contained equipment for manufacturing fake identification documents. Most disturbing of all, investigators found evidence of a surveillance network that extended far beyond the immediate area. Trail cameras disguised as natural debris had been positioned at strategic locations throughout the mountain range. Feeding images to a central monitoring station, Guardian had constructed in the deepest part of the cave system. He had been watching potential victims for weeks or even months before making contact, learning their routines, identifying the best moments to approach. The level of premeditation was staggering. Agent Chen's team began the painstaking process of recovering and analyzing footage from dozens of hidden cameras. The images they found were haunting glimpses into Guardian's hunting methodology. Families laughing around campfires, unaware they were being watched. Children playing in streams, while a predator studied their movements from the shadows. Parents setting up tents, choosing campsites that Guardian had already identified as perfect for abduction. The footage also revealed how Guardian operated during the actual kidnappings. He didn't use violence or obvious threats. Instead, he would approach families as a concerned outdoorsman, warning them about dangerous weather or wildlife in the area. He would offer to guide them to safer camping spots, leading them deeper into the wilderness, where rescue would be impossible. By the time families realized their mistake, they were already completely dependent on their captor for survival. The Morrison family footage was particularly difficult to watch. Guardian had been observing them for 3 days before making contact, learning their routine, identifying David as the decision maker and Sarah as the emotional center of the family. When he finally approached their campsite, he came bearing gifts. Fresh fish he claimed to have caught, warnings about a storm system moving in, offers to show them a more sheltered camping area. The family's trusting response was heartbreaking to witness. As winter deepened, the task force received a break that changed the entire direction of the investigation. A retired forest ranger named Bill Patterson contacted Agent Chen with information about strange encounters he'd had during his 30-year career. Patterson had been working the Cascade region since the 1970s and remembered multiple incidents involving a man who matched Guardian's description. Patterson's testimony revealed that Guardian had been hiding in plain sight for decades. He would periodically emerge from the wilderness to work seasonal jobs with logging companies, fire suppression crews, and even park maintenance teams. He used different names and had somehow acquired legitimate-looking documentation for each identity. This allowed him to earn money, purchase supplies, and most importantly, gather intelligence about families planning wilderness trips. The ranger's records, meticulously kept throughout his career, provided a timeline of Guardian's activities that matched perfectly with the pattern of family disappearances. Patterson had always been suspicious of the man he knew as Robert, James, or Michael, depending on which identity Guardian was using at the time. There was something off about his behavior, an intensity when discussing families with children that made Patterson uncomfortable. Most significantly, Patterson revealed that Guardian had approached him just 6 months earlier, seeking work with a trail maintenance crew. The encounter had been brief, but Patterson noticed that Guardian seemed different, more urgent, almost desperate. He had been asking specific questions about which trails were being closed for winter, which areas would be completely inaccessible to search teams. At the time, Patterson had assumed Guardian was planning extended wilderness camping. Now he realized Guardian had been planning his escape route. This information allowed Agent Chen to narrow the search area significantly. Guardian was likely holed up in one of the remote valleys that would be cut off by snow until late spring. The task force began analyzing topographical data, looking for locations that met Guardian's criteria, hidden from aerial surveillance, accessible only by foot, with natural water sources and shelter possibilities. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of Guardian's journals had revealed disturbing information about the Morrison family's fate. Hidden within seemingly routine entries about weather and supply management were coded references that Dr. Hawkins eventually deciphered. Guardian had been planning to move the Morrison family to a permanent location, a place he referred to as the Promised Land, where they would live out their days under his protection. The October 1983 entries suggested that the Morrison family's escape attempt had partially succeeded. They had managed to leave the hidden shelter and make it several miles toward the main trail before Guardian tracked them down. But instead of returning them to captivity, something had changed Guardian's plans. The coded entries suggested he had been forced to make a decision he hadn't anticipated, something that altered the course of his entire operation. Dr. Hawkins believed that the Morrison family's escape attempt had taught Guardian valuable lessons about security and control. His subsequent victims showed evidence of much tighter restrictions, more sophisticated psychological manipulation, and shorter periods of captivity before being moved to permanent locations. The Morrison family had been Guardian's learning experience, and their resistance had made him a more dangerous predator. As spring approached, Agent Chen prepared for what she knew would be the final phase of the manhunt. Guardian had had months to prepare his defenses, to choose his ground, to set traps for anyone who might pursue him. The man they were hunting wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a survivalist with decades of experience in wilderness warfare, someone who had turned the mountains themselves into weapons against his enemies. The Morrison family's story had revealed the existence of a monster, but finding that monster in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest would require resources, determination, and courage that would test every member of the task force. Guardian had spent 40 years learning how to disappear in these mountains. Agent Chen had one chance to find him before he claimed more victims. The hunt for Guardian was about to enter its most dangerous phase, where the predator would finally be forced to confront those who sought to end his reign of terror. In the spring of 2008, the mountains would witness a confrontation decades in the making, as law enforcement officers pursued a killer into the same wilderness where the Morrison family had vanished 25 years earlier. The outcome would determine whether Guardian's victims would finally receive justice or whether the mountains would claim more lives in the endless cycle of violence that had begun with a simple family camping trip in the summer of 1983. Spring came late to the Cascades in 2008, but when the snow finally began to melt, Agent Chen's task force was ready. They had spent the winter months preparing for what everyone knew would be the most dangerous phase of the manhunt. Guardian had chosen his battleground, and now they would have to fight him on terrain he had controlled for decades. The search strategy was unlike anything attempted in civilian law enforcement. Drawing on military tactics used in Afghanistan and Iraq, the task force divided into specialized units. Reconnaissance teams, equipped with long-range surveillance equipment, would identify Guardian's location. Tactical units trained in mountain warfare would handle the actual apprehension. Medical teams with helicopter evacuation capabilities would be positioned at strategic points throughout the search area. Dr. Hawkins had spent months analyzing Guardian's psychological profile, and her conclusions were sobering. After decades of successful operations, Guardian would not surrender quietly. He had built his entire identity around his role as protector and savior. Being hunted like a common criminal would trigger a psychological break that could make him extremely dangerous. Worse, if he had current captives, he might view their deaths as preferable to their rescue by corrupt authorities. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, a wildlife biologist studying migration patterns in the high country, contacted the task force with disturbing observations. Her automated cameras, designed to track animal movements, had captured images of human activity in areas that should have been completely uninhabited. Someone was moving through the wilderness with purpose, following routes that avoided all established trails and ranger stations. The images were grainy and taken at extreme distance, but they showed a figure carrying what appeared to be supplies. More disturbing were images that seemed to show multiple people moving together, including what looked like children. Dr. Santos's cameras had inadvertently documented Guardian's activities over the past several months, providing the task force with their first real intelligence about his current operations. Agent Chen studied the timestamps and locations, building a pattern of movement that revealed Guardian's methodology. He was operating from multiple base camps, moving his captives regularly to avoid detection. The route he followed formed a rough triangle, with each point representing a different type of facility. One location appeared to be for long-term housing, another for supplies and equipment storage, and the third for what Dr. Hawkins grimly referred to as processing new arrivals. The realization that Guardian was still actively taking victims sent shockwaves through the task force. While they had been planning their manhunt, he had been continuing his crimes. The urgency of the situation intensified when facial recognition software identified one of the figures in Dr. Santos's photographs as Rebecca Walsh, a 16-year-old girl who had disappeared with her family during a camping trip in Oregon 3 months earlier. The Walsh family disappearance had been attributed to a hiking accident. Their car had been found at a trailhead, their initial campsite located and processed, but no trace of the family had ever been discovered. Now it was clear that Guardian had claimed another set of victims, while law enforcement was still trying to understand the scope of his previous crimes. The knowledge that the Walsh family was out there somewhere, possibly still alive, transformed the manhunt from a quest for justice into a desperate rescue mission. Agent Chen coordinated with search and rescue teams from across the region, but she knew that traditional methods wouldn't work against Guardian. He had spent decades learning how to avoid detection, how to move through wilderness areas without leaving traces. The task force needed to think like their quarry, to anticipate his moves and force him into situations where his wilderness expertise couldn't protect him. The strategy that emerged was based on psychological warfare rather than brute force. Instead of trying to track Guardian through the mountains, they would make the mountains uninhabitable for him. Coordinated helicopter patrols would disrupt his supply routes. Ground teams would systematically destroy his cache sites and backup shelters. Most importantly, they would flood the area with search activity, making it impossible for Guardian to move his captives without being detected. The operation began at dawn on a crisp morning in late April. 50 law enforcement officers, supported by military advisors and wilderness survival experts, deployed across a 100-square-mile area of the most remote terrain in the Cascade Range. Their mission was simple in concept, but incredibly dangerous in execution: force Guardian out of hiding and into a confrontation on terms they could control. The first phase went exactly as planned. Helicopter teams located and destroyed 3 of Guardian's supply caches, eliminating months of carefully stockpiled resources. Ground teams found and dismantled several backup shelters, forcing Guardian to rely on his primary base camp. Radio intercepts confirmed that he was aware of the operation and was moving his captives to what he considered a secure location. But Guardian's response revealed the depths of his paranoia and preparation. Instead of panicking, he activated countermeasures that the task force hadn't anticipated. Hidden explosive devices began detonating along major approach routes, cutting off access to key areas. Tripwires connected to alarm systems alerted him to any movement in the vicinity of his remaining camps. Most dangerously, he began using his captives as shields, moving them constantly to prevent any possibility of rescue without risking their lives. The psychological pressure on the task force was enormous. Every decision carried the potential for tragedy. Move too aggressively, and Guardian might kill his captives rather than lose them. Move too slowly, and he might escape into even more remote areas where rescue would be impossible. Agent Chen found herself making life and death decisions based on incomplete information and psychological profiles that might not accurately predict Guardian's behavior under extreme stress. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Michael Morrison, the 12-year-old boy who had been taken with his family in 1983, was now a 37-year-old man. When news of the manhunt reached him through media coverage, he contacted Agent Chen with information that changed everything. Michael had survived his captivity and escape, though he had never spoken publicly about his experiences. Now, faced with the possibility that other families were suffering as his had, he was willing to share what he knew about Guardian's methods and psychology. Michael's testimony was devastating in its detail. He described Guardian's obsession with control, his need to be seen as a savior by his captives, and most importantly, his ultimate plan for the families he took. Guardian wasn't just holding people prisoner, he was attempting to create a new society in the wilderness, with himself as the patriarchal leader of multiple families who would worship him as their protector and provider. The plan had never worked because Guardian couldn't maintain psychological control over adult captives indefinitely. Parents would eventually attempt escape or rebellion, forcing Guardian to make impossible choices between his ideology and his security. The Morrison family's escape attempt had taught him that adults were too dangerous to keep long term. Since then, he had been focusing on taking children, whom he believed he could raise, to accept their captivity as normal. Michael's information allowed Dr. Hawkins to predict Guardian's likely response to the current pressure. Faced with the destruction of his operation, Guardian would attempt to preserve what he saw as his most important assets, the children he had been grooming to accept his authority. He would sacrifice adult captives if necessary, but he would fight to the death to keep the children who represented his vision of a perfect society. The psychological profile suggested that Guardian's final stand would come at his primary base camp, the location he had spent decades fortifying and improving. This would be where he felt most secure, most in control, most able to defend his twisted vision against the outside world. The task force began focusing their efforts on identifying and approaching this ultimate stronghold. Using Michael's memories of the cave system layout and Guardian's operational patterns, the task force narrowed their search to a series of interconnected canyons in the most inaccessible part of the range. Satellite imagery revealed subtle signs of long-term human habitation, slight discoloration of vegetation that suggested underground structures, unnatural water flow patterns that indicated hidden irrigation systems, and thermal signatures that could represent concealed heating sources. The final approach would require everything the task force had learned about Guardian's methods and psychology. They would have one chance to rescue his current captives and end his decades-long reign of terror. The operation would test not just their tactical skills, but their ability to outthink a predator who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft in the unforgiving wilderness of the Cascade Mountains. As the task force prepared for what would likely be Guardian's last stand, Agent Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap decades in the making. Guardian had been preparing for this confrontation since the day the Morrison family first tried to escape. He knew that eventually someone would come for him. The question was whether the task force was prepared for the lengths he would go to protect what he saw as his life's work. The final chapter of the Morrison family's story was about to be written in the same mountains where their nightmare had begun 25 years earlier, but this time they wouldn't be alone in the wilderness. This time, justice was coming for the monster who had stolen so many families from the world above. The final confrontation began before dawn on May 15th, 2008. Agent Chen's team moved through the darkness like ghosts, using night vision equipment to navigate terrain that would challenge even experienced mountaineers in daylight. They had one advantage Guardian couldn't have anticipated: Michael Morrison's intimate knowledge of how the predator thought, how he planned, how he would react when cornered. The approach to Guardian's stronghold took 6 hours of careful movement through a landscape designed to kill intruders. Hidden pitfall traps lined the narrow approaches. Tripwires connected to rockslide triggers blocked alternate routes. Guardian had turned the canyon itself into a fortress, using the mountain's natural defenses to create killing fields that would stop any conventional assault. But the task force wasn't using conventional tactics. Instead of approaching from obvious routes, they rappelled down sheer cliff faces that Guardian had considered impassable. Technical climbers descended on ropes in complete silence, their equipment muffled to prevent any sound that might alert their target. The plan was to surround Guardian's position before he knew they were there. At exactly 6:47 a.m., thermal imaging confirmed what everyone had feared. Guardian wasn't alone. Heat signatures inside the cave complex showed at least 6 people, including small forms that could only be children. The Walsh family was there, along with others who had been missing for months or even years. Guardian had been building his twisted utopia while the world searched for his victims. Agent Chen made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Instead of waiting for backup, instead of trying to negotiate, she gave the order to move immediately. Every minute of delay increased the chance that Guardian would detect their presence and potentially harm his captives. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was unthinkable. The assault began with precision that would have impressed military special forces. Explosive charges disabled Guardian's early warning systems. Smoke grenades filled the cave entrances, creating confusion and limiting visibility. Flashbang devices disoriented anyone inside, while tactical teams moved through the complex with methodical efficiency. Guardian's response was everything Dr. Hawkins had predicted and worse. Cornered in his sanctuary, faced with the destruction of everything he had built, he didn't surrender or attempt to escape. Instead, he tried to complete what he saw as his sacred mission. If he couldn't save his chosen families from the corruption of the outside world, he would save them through death. The gunfire that erupted in the cave complex echoed through the canyon like thunder. Guardian had prepared for this moment, stockpiling weapons and ammunition for a final battle he knew would come eventually. He fought with the desperation of someone who believed he was protecting innocents from demons, using his intimate knowledge of the cave system to mount a defense that pinned down multiple tactical teams. But Guardian had made one critical error in his decades of planning. He had become so obsessed with external threats that he hadn't considered the possibility of betrayal from within. Rebecca Walsh, the 16-year-old who had been his captive for 3 months, had been waiting for exactly this moment. When the assault began, she didn't cower in terror like Guardian expected. She fought back. The psychological conditioning that Guardian had used to control his victims for decades finally broke under the pressure of rescue. Rebecca grabbed her younger brother and ran toward the sound of gunfire, toward the chaos that represented freedom. Her actions triggered a chain reaction as other captives realized that salvation had finally arrived. Guardian's careful control collapsed in minutes. The families he had spent months or years conditioning to depend on him suddenly saw him for what he truly was, not a protector, but a monster. Children who had been taught to fear the outside world ran toward their rescuers. Adults who had been broken by psychological torture found strength they didn't know they still possessed. The final confrontation came in the deepest part of the cave complex, in the chamber Guardian had designed as his personal sanctuary. Surrounded by the photographs and trophies of his crimes, facing the collapse of his life's work, he made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. But Agent Chen and her team had learned from every mistake, every tragedy, every victim who had suffered at Guardian's hands. When the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, Guardian's reign of terror was finally over. The man who had stolen so many families from the world, who had turned the wilderness into a hunting ground for human prey, was dead. The mountains that had hidden his crimes for decades had witnessed his final defeat. The rescue operation that followed was the largest in Pacific Northwest history. Helicopters evacuated survivors, while medical teams provided emergency care for victims who had been held captive for months or years. The Walsh family was reunited with relatives who had never stopped searching. Other families, though some reported missing years earlier, emerged from the darkness of Guardian's underground kingdom. But not everyone could be saved. The investigation of Guardian's complex revealed evidence of victims who hadn't survived their captivity, families whose stories would never have happy endings. The monster was dead, but the pain he had inflicted would echo through generations of survivors and the families of those who were lost forever. As for the Morrison family, their fate was finally revealed in Guardian's personal journals, found in his sanctuary chamber. David and Sarah Morrison had died during their escape attempt in October 1983, killed not by Guardian, but by the wilderness itself as they tried to lead their children to safety. Emma Morrison had survived until 1985, succumbing to injuries sustained during a failed escape attempt. Only Michael had lived, rescued by a hunting party who found him delirious and alone, too traumatized to reveal his true identity until decades later. The Morrison family's camping trip in 1983 had ended in tragedy, but their story had exposed a predator who might have continued claiming victims for decades more. Their sacrifice had meaning, their suffering had purpose, and their memory would ensure that Guardian's crimes would never be forgotten. The mountains of the Pacific Northwest were finally safe again. Families could camp under the stars without fear. Children could explore wilderness trails without looking over their shoulders, and the darkness that had haunted these peaks for 40 years was gone forever. The Morrison family had found justice at last, and their legacy would protect countless others from suffering the same fate.